Good afternoon. I'm Janet Hotzblad. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion about machine learning and the implications for tax enforcement. Before we start, before we meet the panel, I'd like to go over some of our housekeeping rules. The event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterwards. You can hide captions or adjust the settings with the live transcript button. The speaker biographies are available online along with a brief on this very issue. All participants are muted. You can type your questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time. And please complete a survey at the end of the event. It should only take a minute or two. And lastly, you can engage with us online using hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Now I'd like to introduce our very impressive panel. Please unmute and show yourself, reveal yourself. Alex Engler is a fellow in governance studies at Brookings, where he studies the implication of artificial intelligence and emerging data technologies on society and governance. Alex was awarded the Fulbright Schumann Innovation Award and has recently returned from Germany, where he studied European artificial intelligence governance. John Guyton is the Associate Director within the Research Applied Analytics and Statistics Division at IRS. John has conducted research on a broad range of tax administration challenges, including measurement of the costs to taxpayers of complying with the tax code, the impact of audits on low-income taxpayers, and fairly recently, a study of tax evasion at the top of the income distribution. John currently leads several machine learning projects for the IRS. And Una Mae O'Reilly is the founder and leader of the AnyScale Learning for All group at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. Her group at MIT focuses on artificial adversarial intelligence through machine learning and evolutionary algorithm lenses. Among her many achievements, she's received the Best Paper Award at the International Conference on Artificial Intelligence and Law for a co-authored paper entitled Tax Noncompliance Detection Using Coevolution of Tax Evasion Risk and Audit Likelihood. Alex, John, and Una, thank you so much for agreeing to be here today. As many of us suspect, the IRS has a lot of information about us. The agency receives over 3 billion information reports each year. Those are the W-2s you get from your employers, the 1099s that we get from the banks and brokerage houses, and so forth. The IRS also collects data from other government agencies and private entities. And it appears that the more third-party information that's available to the IRS, and in particular, information that aligns very closely to what's on the tax return, the more likely taxpayers are to comply with the tax code. But still, a lot of the data goes underused. Partly that's because of money. In real dollars, the IRS's budget has been cut by over 24% since 2010. It's lost experienced staff, partly because of a hiring freeze over part of that period, and its technology is long overdue for modernization. But some of the reasons the data is underused is because much of it doesn't actually align well, specifically well, with the amounts that are reported on the tax returns. There are perhaps several degrees of separation a lot between the data it receives and the amounts on tax returns. Last year, President Biden proposed boosting the IRS budget by 55% over the next decade, that's after adjusting for inflation, with a portion to be spent on investing in machine learning. That investment was aimed at enabling the agency to better leverage the information it gets to target compliance activities. Which brings us here today to understand the merits and the challenges of this approach. We have a diverse audience today with people who are fluent in tax, others who are fluent in machine learning, some who are fluent in neither, and in fact, a handful I see who know both. But to get us all on the same page, Let's start with some basic definitions. I'm going to turn to Una May, and John, you add if these definitions are different than what's being used today in government. But the first basic question is, what is machine learning? Seems very basic at the beginning of this.
Start. Machine learning is a form of artificial intelligence, and it makes predictions or classifications from data. Now, how does that work? Well, in practice, machine learning gives you a model, right? And what this model allows you to do is to input some characteristics of your data, and for that data, make a prediction about it, or classify it, or reveal some pattern in it. And that model is typically a nonlinear function of some sort with weights and parameters. And the actual notion of machine learning is that to get this model, you have to train it with examples from the past in order to find the right weights or the right parameters for it. And you can go back to historical data, and not only can you find examples of what you would input to this model, you can also find examples of what would have come out of the model that you desired to come out of the model. And that constitutes a label, these outcomes that you want. So you can go back to historical data, you can find examples, you can extract their features, and you can match them with the outcome you desire, which is the label. And that forms a data set through which the model is trained. And the weights are adapted from a initialization to a setting that conforms with your expectations of the model. And what that lets you do now is take examples from the same kind of circumstances you used your examples, your training set from in the present, for which you don't know the label. And the model will now have been trained with weights to be able to produce a label that's consistent with its understanding of that context.
So a lot of people, when you say the term machine learning, think it's all machines, it's all computers. But there is a role for human beings in this. What do the humans add to machine learning? What do we do?
There's sort of two big ways in which humans are involved in the machine learning process. One is that often we go back to historical data and we need to find features in it. And so much of the work of machine learning, like 95% of it, is preparing the data so that you can give it to these models and run the algorithm that trains the weights. Right? So much of that work is human intensive because it involves understanding of the domain of where the model is going to be applied. It involves making sure that the data is consistently recorded, that there isn't missing data, or handling missing data, handling the error rate in the examples. So that's one place where humans are extremely useful, and that's where machine learning specialists work. The other thing is to remember that machine learning models are just tools like any other tool you have. They're predictive tools, but they come with errors, and so one really needs to understand how they interpret their data and have an explanation for their results. And so much of that then means that they have to be embedded into a human-centered process, right? Where they are just one of the tools in trying to understand or achieve some bigger framed goal.
That's interesting. Now, there are categories of machine learning, and to keep it simple today, the two that are perhaps most relevant, although John can correct me on this, are supervised machine learning, which I think you've given a great description of in terms of the examples, but then there's also unsupervised learning. What is the difference between the two?
Well, so unsupervised learning turns out to be incredibly useful for handling text, right? Because text doesn't come with labels, right? You want to be able to understand text. You want to be able to find the semantic patterns, the syntactic patterns or the grammar patterns in text so that you can come up with some semantic understanding of it. So with unsupervised learning, we don't have labels. We actually look at many, many examples and try to cluster them on the basis of similarity and understand those similarities. And as well, we try and form representations of the data that allow something like text to be transformed into something numerical that we can then pass to other methods. So a lot of a lot of work with unsupervised learning is clustering, but I would also call a lot of natural language processing as well to be unsupervised as well.
John, what are the potential benefits to the IRS of expanding its use of machine learning?
The IRS uses machine learning to more efficiently and effectively achieve its mission, which includes both taxpayer services and our enforcement responsibilities. With respect to services, one recently published initiative was the deployment of a voice bot to quickly set up or modify payment plans for balances due without having to visit a taxpayer assistance center or wait to speak to a customer account specialist. With respect to enforcement, IRS select returns using a variety of methods as described in a fact sheet on their IRS website. Won't go into all the details, but a number of these methods do involve machine learning, and machine learning approaches are useful, as Uname was describing, because they automate some aspects of manual work, which saves time, improves internal transparency, and helps us focus audit resources on returns that are more likely to have material issues, sparing other taxpayers from burdensome audits. Beyond enforcements, these methods also allow us to increase taxpayer service offerings to taxpayers.
So beyond the services, are there ways in which the application of machine learning to enforcement help taxpayers? Or does it just make life worse for them because they're more likely to be detected?
Reducing audits where there's not a material change or there's not a change at all reduces burden on the population. So this is about aligning the right treatments for the right folks, and it's helpful to not get put in the right box, to not get put in the wrong box.
Okay. So last week, the IRS and Tax Policy Center sponsored their annual conference on tax research related to tax administration. And an impressive number of those papers focused on machine learning and were either co-authored or in some way co-sponsored in some way by the IRS Research Division. And I imagine you had a big hand in that research. Can you tell us about the ongoing studies, and if there's anything else that's going on in your group on machine learning? Can you tell us about those studies?
Well, sure. I'll keep this general. In addition to work on general methods around both supervised and unsupervised methods, along the lines of what Uname laid out at the beginning, more recent work has focused on maintaining representativeness of the populations, understanding compliance risk across the population, while focusing on the areas that are most important to understand. Also been working on building a systemic understanding of compliance risks associated with pass-through enterprises, where you have to take into account graph theoretic or network kind of aspects. And then factoring in taxpayer behavioral responses and how to think about that in this context. Those would be the three main areas that were covered in the research conference.
How far along are those studies?
Some are more developmental, some are moving towards pilots. So it varies.
Excellent. To the other panelists, this research that was done last week or shown last week was, as I said, either written with IRS co-authors or was somehow associated with sponsored by the IRS. Coming in from the outside, is there a role for people who don't have those relationships with the IRS to be contributing to the IRS's understanding of machine learning and tax enforcement or tax administration more broadly?
I can add a little bit here. So, I think, and I'm going to tie this back to your first question too, because I think it's sort of important, right? There wasn't really a moment where the IRS just decided to start using machine learning. There wasn't like an on-off switch. This has probably been a slow, incremental development where you sort of say like different, better statistics lead to incremental improvements over time. And that's ongoing, right? It probably, it certainly at the absolute minimum goes back 10 years to when there were decision trees implemented in the RRP program. That's the auditing review program. But I suspect that there were many models that go back decades before that the IRS used to guide its thinking. And to your question on human review, I would say these models are probably as much about informing how the IRS makes rules and approaches their human-driven processes as it even is about automated detection, right? This isn't like Netflix movie recommendations where it's just a totally autonomous system telling you what movie to watch. It's a back and forth between algorithms and people trying to learn the best they can from data. That being said, there have been developments, probably transitioned from these sort of older but still very useful structural models to some minor machine learning with decision trees. And now it seems like there's a more mixed approach with supervised machine learning and supervised. And then in this conference, we saw some of a new approach of reinforcement learning as well, which is a type of machine learning we haven't mentioned yet. But the general idea is that there's sort of a progression of slightly more advanced methods being informed by the broader field of non-compliance, of fraud detection, of the machine learning literature. So I do think there's a back and forth between external researchers and the IRS here too.
You know, it's also interesting because, as you say, I mean, there's been this sort of elevation over time in terms of the methods, but there also seems to be an elevation over time in terms of the complexity of the issues that are being explored. I mean, I was kind of really struck last week by some of those issues that were coming up. But before we get there, in terms of doing research on machine learning, and we can open this more broadly, but also more specifically with respect to tax administration, what are we looking for? What are the metrics for evaluating whether a machine learning approach, or specifically in the tax world, how do we measure success? What is the measure of effectiveness? John, what are the kinds of measures that you're looking at when you do these studies?
Well, it depends upon the program, and ultimately it's tied to the objectives of the program goal. I mean, these are themes that both Alex and Una may have hit, and so if the goal is to increase the amount of detected noncompliance while reducing the no change rate, if that's the goal, that's what we're trying to do. If the goal is to try and help people get into a payment plan that meets their needs, allows them to juggle their responsibilities with the other obligations in their lives, then if we get take up on programs that they need, then that's success. So it's really around the goals of the programs that the models are supporting.
I can add a little bit because Jen and I spend a lot of time looking at the return review program specifically, and the return review program is the process by which the IRS chooses which tax returns to audit and to evaluate more thoroughly. And this is where we're seeing the development of these machine learning systems that I was just talking about. And there's a few metrics. John just mentioned a low no change rate. This is the rate at which an audited return leads to no change in that return. And for the IRS, that's bad. That means they did effort on an audit and nothing happened, right? So you want to avoid those because it's
also bad for the taxpayer because they go
bad for the taxpayer too, absolutely, right? You just had your time wasted by the IRS. It's bad for everybody. Great point. Another metric is the resulting revenue. You might change two tax returns, but if it only leads to $10 more in some tiny change in the audit, well, that wasn't a really good use of an audit either. It didn't lead to a change that fixed a substantial problem or led to more appropriate revenue for the IRS. So that's the second. Complicating this more, audits also cost different amounts of money. So if your machine learning system says, hey, you can get more revenue from this audit, but it's an audit against a company that's going to fight tooth and nail and go through every single legal avenue it has to fight the audit system, the audit process, then the amount of that audit costs might not even be feasible, even if it's a good recommendation. So all these are some of the metrics that IRS has to balance in making these choices, which makes it quite a challenging problem, the one that you could argue algorithms are helping with substantially. And then you also, at the end of this, might also really care about how these metrics end up affecting people differently. are you making more mistakes with low income people? Are you not auditing enough for high income people who are, effectively avoiding audits in the historical data, and then maybe also in the future because the algorithms have just a smattering, but that's some of the metrics that really stuck out to me that were important in this
So
process.
let's stick with that last point and expand on that. And this gets to an issue that is going to happen in research, is going to happen in application, and it's happening now. We know John has done research in the past, has looked at the impact of correspondence audits. These are audits that are done through correspondence. There's no face-to-face interaction. They tend to focus on a few issues, and a great number of them are for earned income tax credit recipients, lower income taxpayers. John, in his research, and this is before machine learning, but John in his research found that there was a high correlation between a high correlation between a taxpayer being denied the credit and them not responding to the audit. Now, that may be because they realized that the gig was up, the IRS had caught them, but it also might have been the case, as John and his co-authors speculated, that this population had difficulty obtaining the documentation to prove their case. Maybe they didn't have time to take off from work, they didn't have the language skills, or maybe like the rest of us, they're scared of the IRS and they just didn't have somebody to help them through the process. On the other hand, and we talked about this last year at another TPC event with Deputy Commissioner O'Donnell, is that we have observed over time an increase in the no change rate for large businesses, that from 2010 to 2019, audits, of all the audits for large businesses, in 2010, 28% of them were ended in the taxpayer's favor. By 2019, 40%, nearly 40% of those audits were settled in the taxpayer's favor. These are the high no change rates. And in the conversation with the deputy commissioner, again, we don't quite understand, and they've talked with IRS staff throughout the nation, why that's occurring. Now, that is a problem in the current system. We don't know what's going on, why these audits currently are more likely to be in the favor of these larger businesses and maybe not as much for lower income taxpayers. The concern that I'm going to raise the question about is, as described, we're going through historical data. We're teaching the machine to go through the historical data and see the relationship between this, what we've seen in the past, what's been labeled non-compliant, and other variables. In this case, let's say that the lower income people were not responding because they were scared of the IRS. The higher income people, higher income businesses, the big corporations, they were responding, but they had the resources to prevail over the IRS, but maybe they weren't compliant. So we have these false positives, these false negatives. And this is what the machines are learning from, what can be done to mitigate the impact of historical data that frankly may be wrong? And I'm sure this issue comes up beyond tax data. You've been working on this for a while. What do we do in other applications?
I think if you go back to my description of machine learning, what I was saying was you need to come up with features that describe the data, that allow you the model to make an accurate decision. And this is where the humans are involved, that you need to be able to describe what it is that explains the phenomena that's being classified. So if you do something as crude as saying, here is the description of someone's, and I'm saying this very crudely and simplistically, I'm not saying this is what the IRS does. What I'm saying is that if you use a set of features and you have the model predict on the basis of those features whether or not someone is compliant, you may have the wrong features.
Mm-hmm.
And so the hard work ahead of everyone is to understand what it is that characterizes these large large companies, and they tend to be much, much larger financial structures and have a lot more complex trusts and asset basis shifts and various asset switches, so that they can create bigger and bigger and more complex financial structures around which you would have to look for compliance. And both creating the IRS being able to, anyone being able to connect all the dots and get the data and then decide what the appropriate data is to feed the model to train it, those are the challenges. But that's how you solve the problem, right? You find out that the low income taxpayers who are not really who maybe you're giving changes to, but they have low value in terms of the revenue recovered, then that helps. A feature of their returns is different from the features of these higher, more complex commercial enterprises. So it will be about understanding what characterizes the non-compliance in those cases, and it could even be that you have to build a different model for the two different cases.
I mean, I
for
think,
corporations versus people.
Whether we're talking about machine learning or we're talking about the existing system, I think this is saying the need perhaps more research, but maybe more research than the typical compliance studies that the IRS has done, that I have participated in, not as a participant, but as someone who's analyzed the data. But I mean, it really perhaps speaks to different methods of research that can get at these issues that our current metrics may not be getting at. So John, I toss that back to you as a research need for the IRS. Maybe it's ethnographic research to accompany the kinds of studies that have been done and machine learning. Alex, you're bursting to talk.
I am a little, yeah. So there's, because we heard about some of this at the IRS TBC conference earlier this week, which I learned a ton from. This is a universal problem in machine learning, especially supervised machine learning. If you take a model and you train it on historical data and you say that historical data tells you what success is, those are the patterns that it will discover and proliferate into the future. And so whatever is happening right now and in the past that leads to successful audits, the patterns that the machine learning model, or at least the supervised ones, will find in that data is what it will predict in the future. This can lead to a few problems. If there are mistakes now, it will not recognize that, and it will say, keep auditing these types of audits that were successful in the past, and thus you will lead to success in the future. But if you're missing big important ones now, which there's clear evidence to the no change rate, and based on the fact the IRS is so dearly underfunded, you could expect those problems to happen in the future. There's a path around this, and the IRS knows this well. And this part of the national research program at the IRS randomly selects audits, randomly selects returns to audit. And this randomization is supposed to get around this problem. So you don't get too locked into your statistical thinking about how to lead you to various auditing strategies. The randomness should be a check on getting locked too much into your own sort of thinking. Of course, audits are expensive, and so the IRS has this problem of how to balance the random audits, which don't return very much funding. They have a very high no change rate, again, because they're random, and the ones that are risk-based or driven by this sort of statistical thinking, and also with human reasoning as well. This is a key challenge, and I think balancing those two goals. This isn't unique to the IRS. Almost everyone building a predictive system, if you just rely on the predictive system, the machine learning model creates a feedback loop and eventually starts fooling itself. So this is the good news is everyone has this problem. The bad news is the IRS has it, and also not enough money.
John, you look like you want to talk.
Yeah, so Uname and Alex have gone a long way to answering your question, I believe. And so let's start off with the ability to ask your question points a long ways towards the ability to solve the problem. And this goes back to Uname's point about the importance of humans in the process to understand what the issues are, what the challenges and limitations are, so we can take steps to conduct additional studies, acquire additional data to address it. Let's note something important between the two examples that you mentioned, and that's around the burden of proof. With a lot of For deductions and credits, the burden of proof tends to be on the taxpayer. If something looks unusual, we contact them and ask for substantiation. That's the way the law is written. That's the way it works. And so there can be challenges in people doing that. It could be, as you said, that they're non-compliant and that they don't respond, or they could be they could have other challenges, which makes it difficult for them to respond. And so there are two ways to think about that. One is additional data. Alex pointed to kind of one example for additional data. There are others, in terms of the modeling for training, but it also points to other treatment opportunities. Are there needs to get assistance to these taxpayers? If we can understand what the mechanisms are, then it can point to maybe there are solutions here that can help taxpayers out. On the other end of the scale, where the issue is around income misreporting, the burden of proof is on us. And so in many ways, the opportunities are around bringing in other data or other methods to try and cross-validate. If we have what might be a false negative, is there other evidence that suggests we should keep looking and not discount that, versus learn that no, there's not something there. So in many ways, other data to cross-validate is a way to guard there. But it comes back to the people and sort of understanding what the challenges are and making sure that the models aren't operating blindly, that they're being calibrated to account for these issues.
So I've got a two-pronged question as a follow-up here, which is, first of all, for those who are not familiar with the IRS research, National Research Program, the NRP, is a study that's conducted that pulls randomly a sample of taxpayers and audits them. And the level of audit, the severity of the audit, the toughness of the audit varies somewhat from just checking third-party information to correspondence to the actual face-to-face audit. There is an issue with those studies, which is not all income underreporting is detected. And so the IRS has this statistical method, the detection estimation procedure, in which they make an adjustment for the income that's not reported. I won't go into all the details of how that's done, but the issue is, like, a question is kind of like twofold, which is, we know that, again, in the evidence, that we don't know fully how much income is underdetected. There are these adjustments that are made to the NRP. And there's also operational audits. So if you were doing examples from the NRP, would you take it before or after the adjustment has been made for underdetected income? If you're doing if you're taking the examples from operational audits, which is what you really have to do for businesses, do we have a sense that operational audits tend to be better in terms of detecting income that's not reported by the taxpayer? John, you're on the hook for that.
And these are areas of active research, and really it comes down to the objectives that you're developing the model for. We have a variety of objectives with tax administration. So this is an area of current study, and calibration between different selection methods has statistical and measurement issues. Let's go in a little into the weeds for this audience, but I think we can acknowledge that if there are different selection methods and different scope and extent of the audit, you're going to measure something different, and that one needs to reflect that in the work, and we endeavor to do that.
Can I add a really quick thought? I just think, the IRS is a profoundly hard challenge here, which is that it's being asked both to do enforcement and measurement at the same time. anyone who has ever worked with data will tell you that if you want to measure something and enforce something using the same data, you're going to lead to a challenging environment, right? So you're asking people, hey, tell us about your income. We want to just learn about this. Also, we're the agency famous for enforcing whether or not you have paid enough taxes, right? And that is a meaningful, that's the core of the challenge. It's always going to be hard to directly measure the tax and tax gap if you're also the agency that's doing the enforcing. And so I think this, no matter what type of machine learning you use or what type of algorithms you use, this is going to be an ongoing challenge.
So this may come as a surprise to the panelists in the audience, but the tax code's complicated. And administering a complicated tax code is also complicated. And sometimes that complexity, it leads to ambiguous interpretations of a law. It leads to disputes. Sometimes it has to go to the tax courts to settle, or even to the US district courts to settle. And it really comes down to this question of, when you have such complexity, and the tax code is one, but I'm sure Una May has seen examples elsewhere. They're not maybe easy to categorize. How do you come up with labels when you've got issues that are as complicated and open to ambiguity as the tax code might be? Anyone? Maybe this is the unanswerable question in terms of machine learning, is what do we do when the examples are too complicated to label?
And let's back up, because I don't understand you here. We do have labels. We have audit outcomes, and then given some of the fact that that's not a final answer, if you will, there are a variety of administrative appeals procedures for those, and we have outcomes from those, which are labels as well. Can we know the truth given different capabilities, different resources of all parties? That's a question for the researchers perhaps, but in terms of the legal outcomes, we do have labels. So I'm confused. Maybe you can clarify.
Well, one is, do you go as far as the court cases? The data I'm familiar with the IRS sort of stops before it goes outside. I mean, it's the appeals process, but courts may rule differently. Is that part of the data that you were looking at?
It depends on the objectives of the model. I mean, where we have data on that, that's an option. So I don't see that as an inherent barrier.
Can I add a note here? I do think, and maybe John will disagree with this, but I think the labels eventually shake out okay, or as okay as most predictive problems, right? There's very little where the absolute objective proof of the past. And the question isn't, is it perfect, but does the machine learning approach marginally improve over prior approaches, right? That's their only question. This isn't about being right about anything. It's about getting better. And so I do think their labels are very likely, based on the research I've seen, able to do that. The delay is a challenge, though. And one of the reasons that, and so these court cases and these audits can take years. And so sometimes as we've noted in our primer, the models could be not only referencing a different tax environment where there's different behaviors, different responses, but even a different tax code if there have been code changes that are relevant in the last few years. So that delay is a challenge. One of the reasons that I was interested to see that the IRS is using a mix of supervised and unsupervised models is that unsupervised models don't necessarily have this exact problem. They don't need lots of completed prior audits. They're just looking for unusual, in our case, they're just looking for unusual returns, tax returns that really stick out, that don't match, any of the other returns. And that also can be a way that these algorithms can identify potential targets for auditing. And I should say an unusual return or an outlier doesn't automatically mean that it's not compliant or fraudulent, but it could be a sign that a human review is warranted to see there. And that's another approach. And as far as I can tell, the RRP program is mixing these approaches together, partially because of this delay that we've been talking about.
And so
there's something wider spread than that, which is this idea that, Alex mentions anomalies or outliers. Instead, what you can see is a change in trends. So as the tax code changes, uh, filers adjust their ways of um, sending in a claim, right? And think of it as like the health insurance industry, where the minute you change the diagnostic codes and what the insurance company will pay for, all of a sudden the diagnosis coming from the physicians changes, right? And so what you could use unsupervised learning to do is to see how, on a large scale, returns are changing with respect to the changes about in the tax code on certain aspects of it, right? And I think one of the things I learned, I'm a very, very much a baby person in terms of my knowledge of the tax code, but it's almost like you add more, you very rarely take anything away, right? And so it's this accretion of more and more special cases and cross references and cross checks amongst the different clauses in the code that allows these gaps to appear. And you can see, like, more than one person is going to take advantage of a gap if it arises. They're all going to sort of almost concurrently figure it out.
Mhm.
And so you can see a trend in that if you've introduced some sort of, it's possible with these methods to see trends in a population's response to something changing in their environment. And in this case, the population would be taxpayers, and the situation would be the code.
Right. So this is the preparer community spreading information. It's the people talking to their neighbors, and
Well, I think at the corporate level, it's accounting practices.
yeah.
And the big thing is happening at the large underreporting is not coming from individual tax returns probably as much as it's coming from corporate tax returns. And those corporations have very, very large accounting practices and best processes. And with that, they're always looking for a way to optimize their tax returns, right? To minimize their tax. And so you've got an adversary on the other side, a very intelligent adversary who's learning, who's able to look at adjustments to the tax code and make adjustments themselves in their strategy to minimize the tax owed by a large corporation.
So this sort of flows into the research that you had done on evasion in the tax code. And it wasn't purely, what we can do is with machine learning, we can see what people have done in the past. We can see emerging trends. But I think in your research, you were saying that sometimes you don't have the data to anticipate how taxpayers will behave. And can you tell us about that and how you try to approach that in a world where there's machine learning?
Right. I mean, I think it's an interesting experience because when the problem was introduced to me and my research team at MIT, um, you know, I assumed that there would be some sort of, identity stripped data that I would have access to. So I, immediately thought, oh, I can come up with a supervised learning approach to thinking about how to find some of these very, very involved problems in a particular section of the code. And then, I was forced to be more resourceful because there was no code available. Academics don't have access to that information and they shouldn't. And so how does one approach a problem? Well, what you can do is you can actually model taxpayers and you can model the tax code with artificial intelligence, and you can model behavior by the tax collection agency. So at a very abstract level, we tried to tie our work a little bit into an understanding of particular tax schemes for noncompliance and a particular area of the tax code. We used AI to represent the tax code as a set of rules and regulations. And then we also modeled these very, very, the ability of corporations to create very, very large financial structures within which they could hide noncompliance by patterns of behavior. And our machine learning was able to, sort of acting as the IRS side, it was given the objective to find very, very high paying non-compliance in these structures. And so we had sort of an adversarial system set up where, there was a dynamic arms race going on with the, not necessarily that the code itself was shifting at all, just that, we know that tax collection agencies have limited resources, right? And while their objective is to find noncompliance, they want to find the noncompliance that results in the largest recovery of funds, and which minimizes the use of their resources, right? And given that objective, we could model that, but then we also gave objectives to potential tax filers, which was to minimize their tax by using the rules of the tax code. And with that, we could kind of replicate some of these schemes at a very, very abstract level, I must say, far, far more easily than anything that could be done inside the IRS, because we made assumptions that these entire large financial structures, we had access to them as a great network. And it's connecting all those dots that's half the work in the data, a lot of the work in the data.
So Alex, you've returned from Germany and you've been studying the EU's governance for AI. What lessons did you learn from there that's applicable to the IRS when it starts moving into machine learning?
So I think this comment is going to a little bit come towards the broader use of what government should do and may need to do in terms of transparency and openness around AI systems. So the EU is going to pass a piece of legislation called the Artificial Intelligence Act. It identifies a series of types of use of AI that are high risk, and then creates requirements for those high risk uses of AI. One of them is going to be the use by governments for things like giving out public benefits and investigating fraud. This is almost certainly going to count as high risk. And what they're saying is, if you do that, you're going to have to register this algorithm. You're going to have to create a little bit of public awareness that it exists. The IRS, of course, already does this, but also subscribe to a bunch of standards around things like data quality and accuracy and cybersecurity and others. The idea here is that the EU wants to make sure there's sort of a floor of quality for algorithmic systems. My vague sense is that the IRS would soar over that floor. The reason I say that is because the IRS is not paying some outside developer that particularly, or sort of making a slapdash AI system that it's buying from a private vendor. It's a lot of professionally trained expert statisticians building these AI systems with deep subject matter knowledge of the topic. So while there is a standard that's coming from the EU that they're going to say, we want agencies to really understand and do some reporting and some thoroughness around their AI systems, that level of standard, I honestly think the IRS would soar above. That being said, I do think the IRS might want to consider how to enable some sort of outside scrutiny. This auditing prediction really, really matters. We talked briefly about false positives earlier, but I do think it's fair to say that the doomsday scenario for these systems is that they flag someone, either preventing them from getting benefits, potentially including the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit in the near term, and maybe even leading to an audit and preventing them from getting those benefits over a much longer time window, while they are because they were erroneously flagged by an AI system. I don't have any reason to believe that happens all the time, but it sort of definitionally has to happen some of the time. These systems are never perfect. And having some outside scrutiny into, what trade-offs the IRS is making on those decisions is worth considering. I understand there's also problems with making too much of the system known to the public because of tax avoidance and evasion schemes. But some middle ground, maybe where independent researchers evaluate the system and make recommendations, but don't publicly reveal how it works, is something I'd be considered. And again, this is partially inspired by the EU's approach to AI governance.
Okay, we have some questions here from the audience. Sorry, as I am having some technical issues here. What challenges? I mean, this gets into a whole work environment issue. One question is, I'm going to follow up to is, what challenges does the IRS face in attracting and retaining talent with machine learning skills? And related to that is a question I've had, which is how do machine learning experts communicate with tax experts? So that gets into the whole personnel issue. John, it seems to me that a lot of the studies that were presented last week, you had a group from Stanford, a mix of lawyers, economists, data scientists who were looking into the partnership issue. You had some work being done by IRS and MITRE. How much in-house expertise do you have on machine learning? How much more will you need in the future going forward? This is a growth industry for the IRS and hiring.
Absolutely, it is. We do have a fair number of in-house resources. Do we need more? Absolutely, we do. Have a number of tools been put at our disposal to help with that. There has been some things that have been done in terms of job series for machine learning, folks with machine learning expertise. So we have had some improvements there. It still takes resources. What we can do is in part tied to the resources that we have, but we do have some in-house resources, and we have some, increasing ability to attract the right resources where we have the right skill sets, where we have the resources to hire them.
I think one thing to keep in mind is that there's machine learning research and then there's machine learning in practice. And what really has changed in the last 5 to 10 years is how much machine learning has tech transferred over to practice. And that means that there are personnel who don't have to have PhDs in machine learning to help the IRS and who could join it. You can get all sorts of the plethora of data science programs, technology and policy programs like the one at MIT, the TPP program. All of those are training master's degree level candidates, and those that's a great change because they're more employable and there's more of them than there are people graduating with PhDs in machine learning.
Let me just second that the kind of mixed skills that Una was talking about is very important in terms of bringing these kind of capabilities into actual practice. So thank you for making that point. That's critical.
I know of one researcher who works with you who is a tax law expert and an economist. But again, it gets to this question, and I'm sure he also has data analytics skills, but it does also get to this issue, and you both have experienced it. How do tax experts talk to machine learning experts? How do humans learn to talk to each other about machine learning?
I laugh because, initially when we were approached to work on our project, we went to the internet and we basically Googled these different tax evasion schemes and learned all about them. But we realized very quickly that we were completely out of our depth. But it took me, I went through an initial student, and then I had a student who was with me for 2.5 years. That student devoted half of his research to understanding tax policy and the tax code. And then the other half was working on the modeling and simulation we did. And I think that goes back to what John's talking about, is that you need, from the academic perspective, students who are driven by applying new methods to have impact on technology and policy, or impact on policy through technology. I think that's the ideal way you want to do this. I do know that, we were not fit for the IRS consumption for a long time. I think we used our intermediaries, the MITRE Corp. They were well versed in the area they were pointing us to, and so they supported us. And it took a long time and a lot of work. It took my student going and meeting with them, and then my student briefing me. And at one point, I said, "Can we just order the tax code?" And and my student said, "Well, that's gonna be volumes, you don't want that." So it was quite an experience. But I think the thing is to capitalize on teaching people that. It would be great to have courses where people look at the intersection of technology and taxation, and where people learn about both the policy and the technology pieces of it. Because there's few people who sit at that intersection and it's quite a complex intersection to position yourself at.
So
From
once
my
your
perspective.
student,
I
once
jump
your,
on there.
I have a quick question. Once your student invested 2.5 years learning the tax code, has he done
Just a
anything?
particular section of it and understanding how that section led to these various schemes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because what he had to go do, what we went together and did was we built a representation of the tax code, right? We actually sort of made it so that, when a particular financial structure needed to be scrutinized for whether it had underreported or not, we could do this because we had a reference. We had literally computationalized, algorithmized a piece of the tax code. And that's the AI piece of it, right? So he had to learn what he was doing. He had to learn what he was trying to do first, and then he had to figure out how to do it.
So he now works for an investment group doing those kinds of tax shelters. Oh, I'm joking. Alex, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. What were you going to say?
Not at all. I've been super involved in the space, so I just want to give a shout out to a couple of programs. Georgetown now has a data science and public policy master's. The University of Chicago has a computational analysis and public policy degree. Carnegie Mellon has a mixed PhD in machine learning and public policy. Other schools are making investments too. It's a somewhat new field, maybe like 10 years-ish.
But MIT has something called TPP, Technology Policy Program. And that's
yes, so I will draw a distinction. It's a great program. I will just draw a distinction between teaching people to do data science in policy environments and teaching technology policy, which I think are actually two fairly distinct things, but both very important, both good interdisciplinary uses and certainly a lot of overlap. But these programs are really about how to teach people to be data scientists in civic and public service roles. And then on the federal government side, the US Digital Service has started hiring for data scientists. There's an explicit role. So if you're like watching this, you're like, I want to be a data scientist and do data science work at for tax policy or in some other agency, the USDS has now roles where you can apply and say, I want to be a data scientist in the federal government. And that's one of the first systemic pipelines that we're seeing to do this type of work broadly. Though again, places like IRS have had statisticians and machine learning people for a long time. We shouldn't pretend this is all brand new. Some of it's new.
John, you actually have students who are working in collaboration with the IRS on these kinds of projects now? I thought I heard some reference to that at last week's conference.
We do, yes. And on this general point, just following up on what Alex is saying, a little humility and respect for other people's hard-earned expertise goes a long way. I mean, this isn't unique to just this area. We run into it with economists and lawyers, accountants, all, any place where there's deep domain expertise. One has to appreciate what that group brings and work with them a bit to understand their language and their framework.
And are they interested in this work? Do they see how this is going to help them in the longer term? Are they invested?
Well, one of the places where we've seen particular interest is an opportunity to use artificial intelligence, machine learning methods to, for the public good, as opposed to just ad click-throughs. We have an interesting use case for the public, and so for some students that's particularly attractive.
Yeah, and I'm actually the instantiation of what John's talking about. My research group is called Alpha, Any Scale Learning for All. And the point is that I attract students who are interested in doing things that are socially rewarding. And certainly when we took on this particular project, we spent a lot of time thinking about where our position and lens was on it and how it was there for us to help with tax enforcement and not to understand more about how to optimize, for avoidance. And so those sort of, I am the instantiation of what John's talking about, and students flock to my group. I can't support them all.
Well, that's really great. And I'm really feeling inspired, and maybe that's my next life. Not going to happen, but I wish it had. And I'm really glad that you all could join us today. It's been a really good conversation. I know I've learned a lot in the last several months preparing for today's panel. So thank you very much. And for those of you who have been listening, please fill out that survey at the end. So thank you again. all. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Pleasure to be here.
Nice to meet you all.
Bye-bye.